In our contemporary society, we can't stop hearing about inclusion as one of, if not the supreme virtue that we should all aim to promote and adhere to. We assume that as long as everyone feels welcomed and included, we're making the world a better place. This is why words and practices like excommunication are so abrasive to our contemporary sensibilities. It represents a sharp departure or even an antithesis of the modern cardinal virtue of inclusivity. And something like this sentiment caught on in the church in the 20th century, because although the practice of excommunication it wasn't specifically abrogated or reformed, like it's still technically on the books, you could argue that the ideas that became popular after the Second Vatican Council encouraged notions like dialogue and friendship over disciplinary measures like excommunication. Now, I love Venerable Fulton Sheen and deeply value his orthodoxy, his teachings, frankly his humor and wit. But I remember hearing an interview that he gave to William Buckley Jr. in which a question about why the church refrains from using excommunication anymore. And Sheen appeals to the spirit of the times influencing the church's attitude and such practices. Here's what he says.
Well, again, it's a change of the spirit of the times. I think the church has become much more patient and kind. It's more related to the world than it was then. The church was very much locked up in itself. After all, what the Vatican Council did was to relate us to the world. First of all, in the Vatican Council, the world came into the church, and the church went out to the world.
A fairly obvious analogy you could build from this is by claiming that punishing people for crimes and locking them in jails it isn't a very nice thing to do. It certainly isn't inclusive or merciful. So why don't we give people a second or third or however many chances they need? And the answer to this question is pretty dang obvious to any reasonable person, but there are, unfortunately, a few people for whom this needs to be pointed out. When there are no reasonable consequences for crimes, criminals tend to indulge in their criminal activity. Here in Canada, we have embraced, along with a number of other insane political policies, this kind of catch and release attitude towards crime, where it is very easy to get bail, especially if you're from an equity-deserving identity. The result of all this excessive kindness is that in the city of Vancouver, the same 40 offenders were responsible for over 6,000 crimes one year that police assessed they should be charged for, but they simply couldn't because of the scale and futility of it all. What might discourage them from committing so many crimes is actual consequences, actual justice for criminals and satisfaction for victims. A statistic that often comes to my mind when I think about how I interact with difficult people in society and how we should think about these things comes from a 2005 book by Martha Stout called The Sociopath Next Door, which claimed that 1 in 20 people are sociopaths. Other studies I've read about in the news have claimed that about the same frequency exists for psychopathy. And that may not seem like much, but it doesn't take much to harm a community. Imagine like a sports, like a rowing team with 20 people and one of them is rowing in the opposite direction. That's pretty disruptive. And I'm not saying that every person with sociopathy or psychopathy are malicious, but it does show that there are serious adversities to contend with in our human nature as we gather together as a society. All of which is to say that no amount of inclusivity and kind feelings are going to reform people who are maliciously committed to harming other people and causing disruption and chaos in our communities. It means that in a world that suffers from the kind of brokenness that exists in the human race, you can't be naively optimistic about the need for rules and consequences. These kinds of measures become absolutely necessary one way or another. Which means that if you naively and optimistically abolish systems that have been rationally considered, debated, and implemented for generations, or in the case of the church, thousands of years, something more improvised and therefore I would argue less just, less rational, and more impulsive and therefore easily abused will take its place, again, out of necessity. And further, I'd argue that something insidious has taken its place in society and in the church. So let's pause before we evaluate that, just to take a minute to describe what excommunication is and why it exists. First, you have to remember that the church exists to preserve and transmit God's revelation to every generation and to draw people of goodwill into a community of believers for the sake of their salvation, which means that binding yourself to that same church can be the difference between eternal life and death. So the stakes are obviously very high, which is why when a person acts in such a way that places themselves outside of that relationship with God, the church has a duty, an obligation to let them know that they've cut themselves off from that lifeline. That's what excommunication does. It informs confirmed Catholics that they've lost communion with the church, and it provides them with explicit instructions on how to be restored. It also places a pastoral and governing burden on the church to define how this is so that it can't just arbitrarily discipline people or kick them out of the community for no good reason. And the thing is, people do place themselves outside of the church all the time. That hasn't stopped happening. All that stopped happening is the church no longer informs them of that reality so that they might be reformed. There are countless Catholics out there thinking they're doing just fine, all the while they're headed for disaster, and nobody is taking the time or concern to tell them otherwise. And because Catholics still violate communion with the church and even jeopardize the standing of other Catholics by leading them astray, we find that we need some kind of disciplinary mechanism, some sort of measure to respond. And with an unwillingness to use the legitimate form of excommunication, we end up relying on illegitimate forms like canceling people. Now, we're all familiar with the ravages of cancel culture in secular society, but some people may not know that it is, at least in my experience, quite common in the church, in spite of the fact that we've embraced a more pastoral and inclusive age. And it suffers from all kinds of inadequacies that inflict injustice on its victims that excommunication does not. The first is that it gives those doing the canceling a great deal of power that they aren't necessarily legitimately given, with no transparency and no accountability. And as the sex abuse scandals should have taught everybody, this is a huge problem in the church. The ability to make serious consequential decisions without any accountability is what allowed those abuses to happen and then continue to happen. Most people don't realize it wasn't because the church didn't have reasonable canonical rules that should have prevented a lot of what happened. It's that our pastors stopped following those rules and practices like excommunication, and instead dealt with things in a secretive and arbitrary fashion. And those secretive and arbitrary modes of governing allowed for people to be protected who never should have been, and it allowed people to be punished or canceled when they never should have been, especially for speaking out. In short, it promoted an arbitrary climate of fear. And I've seen this kind of arbitrary cancellation happen multiple times in my own local church, both to clergy and to lay people. I've seen priests get canceled and have no idea why. They were just dismissed, exiled to some distant corner, or even kicked out of the diocese because some noisy people, often of a more progressive persuasion, didn't like them for preaching the hard truths of the Orthodox faith. I've also seen other priests just disappear without a trace, as if they never existed. Nobody seems to know what happened to them, and maybe they were removed for good reason, but the problem is nobody knows. And our speculation is probably far worse than the actual reasons that motivated the diocese to keep it quiet. All that it does is encourage speculation and, frankly, gossip. And the church should be something like a family, and our pastors something like our fathers. After all, we call them father. So when one of them just disappears, the family has a right to an explanation. Like, imagine someone from your nuclear family just vanishing one day, and then when you ask, where did they go? You're treated like you're being indiscreet. I want to say another word, but I'll say malarkey. You should have the right to know where they've gone now. And again, it's this pattern of secrecy that ruptures trust and unity within the body. Excommunication, on the other hand, brings things out into the open where there is transparency and accountability to ensure that corruption and misuse of power is kept in check. The other reason that cancel culture in the church is so egregious is because it doesn't offer any kind of remedy for the canceled. When a person is excommunicated, they are explicitly informed about why and how to be reconciled to the church. In fact, that's the main motive for the penalty, to define the way back and encourage them to take that prescription. But with people who are just canceled, they just become persona non grata. They often don't know why, and they don't know how to fix it. And when people's professional lives are at stake, which is often the case for people who have worked for the church, this is a grave injustice and even a sin to be allowed to operate unchallenged within the church. And this is common enough that I know people who have invested huge amounts of time and money to get the necessary formation in order to pursue their passion for serving the church, like theology degrees or even doctorates, and who were eventually maliciously canceled for ideological reasons by modernist colleagues and bishops who should have protected them. Their careers and their reputations were destroyed by this kind of malicious appetite to remove people secretively with no explanation, not for the sake of helping them reform and attain good standing, but simply to punish them for its own sake, for arbitrary reasons that are never defined and never accounted for. So while it may have seemed like ending the practice of excommunication was a way of introducing a more inclusive and kind church to the world, what it has actually done is taken those measures into dark corners and handed them over to malicious people who simply want to harm other people rather than help them be better united to the church. And it is for that reason I think we need to renew our use of legitimate forms of sanction like excommunication and refuse to use arbitrary measures, the kind that cancel culture encourages. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.